Evening, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. I think that there are a lot of people joining us today from different parts of the world, which is fantastic. So for this webinar today, we will be talking about leaving the UK and the implication from a financial, property, lifestyle, everything. I've got a fantastic lineup of experts today who will answer some of your questions. Just as a recap for you all, there is a chat where you can ask some questions as well. So as and when our experts answer some of your questions, you may have other questions popping up. So if you want to ask your questions within this chat, we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. We have received a lot of questions, so if we can't go through them all during this webinar, our experts will have your questions, your name, and we'll be able to answer those separately outside of this webinar. So without any further ado, let's start with the introductions, and let's start with Chris.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining. My name's Chris Lloyd. I'm a partner at Enness, and Enness specialise in helping clients based virtually anywhere in the world primarily get lending, refinancing or purchasing property in the UK. We do also offer lending for Europe and a few other jurisdictions, potentially out in Dubai and the US as well. So in a nutshell, that's what we do, and we're good at getting complicated mortgages put together, usually where a client has spoken to the high street banks beforehand and then require something a little bit more creative. For example, if you've got income in a foreign currency or you're based overseas.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Chris. Geoffrey, over to you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Geoffrey. I'm a private client advisor at Henley and Partners. We specialize in citizenship and residence via investment. So we work with ultra high net worth individuals, family offices, and institutions, and facilitate them to be able to get residency or citizenship globally all over the world. We also do a number of strategic planning when it comes to things like inheritance tax or global mobility.
Thank you very much. Jake?
Hi everyone, I'm the founder of SJB Global. So we specialise in helping British and American expats all around the world. Our speciality is very much on cross-border. So if you are from the UK, we provide structure on pension and investment assets, because when you leave the UK, it can get quite problematic, and there's always changes with regards to the legislation, and there have been some really negative and positive changes over the last year, which will impact people that are leaving the country. So for us, it's just about simplifying things as much as possible and making sure that if you are making the move, whether that's for retirement or work, we can structure things in the best way possible.
Fantastic, thank you very much. John, over to you.
Hi everyone, thanks for dialing in. My name's Jonathan Handford. I'm the interim managing director at Fine&Country. We are a global real estate business. We have a presence in 300 locations worldwide on 6 continents, predominantly a British brand and business. We help people both sell and buy, sometimes exclusively and sometimes independently. So we can operate as buying agents and also as selling agents. A really strong network of overseas operators. So if people are thinking of trying to find a property outside of the UK, we can help with almost a concierge level of service and exclusive access to certain properties, and then local experts on the ground. So you've got that local, regional, national and international presence.
Thank you. And then Matt, over to you.
Here we go, I muted myself. Hi everyone, thank you for joining. My name is Matthew McClure. I'm one of the senior traders at Lumon Pay. We're a currency exchange brokerage based out of Farringdon in London, and we've been in the business for 25 years as of last month. I've worked here for around 5 years now on the dealing team, assisted with moving large volume transfers internationally for property purchases, property sales, international investments, and plenty of other reasons. Been here through the COVID period, the end of one Trump campaign and the beginning of another, as well as the Liz Truss debacle a couple of years ago. So plenty of experience in volatile markets. But at Lumon, we're really here to we're aiming to undercut a bank's exchange rate with our own competitive exchange rates, as well as offering an expert service in timing exchanges and ultimately helping to save money.
Fantastic, thank you. And finally, let me introduce myself. I'm Emily. I'm your host for today. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for Fine&Country, but just the host for today, asking hopefully all the relevant questions for everyone on the call. So maybe one thing that everybody will be interested in, and I will start with you, John, if I may, is for someone beginning their search for a property abroad, what are the key factors they should consider before committing to a purchase?
So some of the key factors, jurisdiction, location and asset. So for jurisdiction, residency, visa routes, taxes, ownership rights, location, there's micro market drivers, flight time, if you're going to be going backwards and forwards and you've got family between them, it's always a consideration. Seasonality, rental demand, I think is another important factor. In terms of the asset, you've got developer credibility that you need to think about, the builder specification, service charges, resale liquidity. There are lots of things to think about rather than just that ideal home in the sun and with access to the sand and to the sea. So yeah, that just some factors to consider.
So there's a lot to consider, and I think looking at all the questions that we received some very specific questions that would relate to the US or Cyprus or Spain or France, and obviously it will be difficult to cover all the destinations on this call, so we will try to cover blanket questions. But when it comes to a certain country, we are also doing other webinars. For example, tomorrow we're doing one on buying in Portugal. So if anyone on the call is interested in buying in Portugal, there's actually a webinar dedicated to this tomorrow. But as John was saying, there's so much to take into consideration depending on when you're looking at buying. But how does the perception of value differ between luxury homes in the UK and overseas destination, and what are our buyers looking for?
So look, it's a great question, and traditionally in the UK you think of transport access, schools, there's heritage, the type and style of property are all factors that people think of. When you're buying overseas, it's more lifestyle, it's the tax residency benefits, they're the factors that come into consideration. So there is a significant difference to how people perceive value subject to where you're buying. And one of the things to consider in this day and age, and I'll use it only because we've had the reference already, COVID has changed the way that the world works. And we're all dialing into a video call now, and that's become a way of life within the last 5 years. So there's been the birth of something that we call digital nomads, where people can do their job practically from anywhere in the world. And with all love and respect to Milton Keynes, if you could dial into your job from Milton Keynes or from the French Riviera, you might be more inclined to do it from the French Riviera. Therefore, places have become more accessible, more attractive for all of those reasons. I really like Milton Keynes, by the way. I've got friends there for anybody dialing into the call. So, but yeah, in comparison to the French Riviera, I think I know where I'd rather be.
I mean, as I say, so people should really ask themselves why they are making the move. Again, in the questions, it went from pensioners and people who want to retire in the sun to families who want to relocate. So there are so many different reasons for people for wanting to make that move. Do you see, and how is the luxury property market going internationally, and are there any hotspots that you're seeing in all this?
Yeah, look, the hotspots are the lifestyle led supply constrained markets. So they're the ones that continue to outperform. You talked about the Portugal webinar that we've got tomorrow, places like the Algarve and Lisbon, Cascais, places like that. They're really popular. The Balearics, Côte d'Azur, the Swiss Italian Alps, Dubai Prime, some of the selected Caribbean islands. But all of those locations, you can see that they're not just overseas, they're attractive lifestyle changes, and that's what people are being drawn to. So they're the hotspots that we're finding within the market, and they're outperforming any global insecurities in terms of what's happening with buyer reticence, because people are rolling the dice and they're going for those changes regardless of what's happening within the greater market spaces. So I think another factor is accessibility. So, if transport is relatively easy for you to not just get back home, but to also get to other places in the world, because let's face it, people aren't going from destination to A to B, from B back to A again. They're actually, we're more interconnected in this day and age than we've ever been before. So I think accessibility for transport is another attractive draw.
So there are so many things to take into consideration to not, I mean, making a move abroad is a big step. And if you make a mistake, it can be an expensive mistake too. How could you or Fine&Country help with such a move?
So I think a lot of people are going to be in a position where they don't actually know where they're moving to. And you can see that by the thread of questions that have come through prior to this webinar. There are certain people, maybe 1 in 5, they know where they're going, they've picked their destination, they're dead set on it. It's just understanding and ironing out the creases in the logistics between them devising the move and executing it. I'd say the other 80% just know and feel like they want to be somewhere else and they want to go for whatever reason it may be. It might be work, tax reasons, it might be lifestyle changes, but they're actually quite open to where they move. So I think the best advice that I can give is you need to speak to agents on the ground to understand the logistics of the market, the process. If you've only ever bought and sold within the UK before, you're in for a bit of a shock. Some of the markets move a lot quicker and a lot easier in terms of the conveyancing process. But for France, for instance, whereas in the UK you've got caveat emptor, it's buyer beware. In France, it's the seller's responsibility to get everything done. So once you're in and you pay a deposit, that deal is locked down with both the buyer and the seller. So you need to know those nuances before you commit to a country, because it might have a bearing upon your decision. So maybe create a short list of potential countries that you can work with, then talk to some of the agents on the ground to understand the process. Obviously talk to the specialists that are dialed in here today and the companies that can assist with that advice, and then you can refine exactly where it is that you want to go to. And it goes without reason to say you also need to go and visit these places in person, because looking through a digital portal at a potential location versus going there, living and breathing it and meeting the locals and getting a feel and a flavour for the culture is very different. And it might be a good idea to visit it in and out of season as well, because that might have a different bearing upon the experience that you have.
And I think as well, to add to this, your estate agent knows the lifestyle. If you want to know if there's a big expat community where you're looking, because maybe your language is not quite there, your French or Portuguese or Spanish is not quite there, and you want to make sure that there's other people around you who speak English, your estate agents will be able to tell you where the expat communities are. Equally, if you want to avoid the expats and be within the local culture, they'll be able to tell you as well. So there are so many things that a local estate agent from a lifestyle point of view will be able to help with as well.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Emily, I was in Costa Blanca and visiting all of the areas around it earlier this year, and culturally the difference to Costa del Sol, like, it's very much a Spanish-speaking location, whereas Marbella is very much English. It was a completely different experience. And where people say, and I was talking to agents on the ground there, oh, we want to be out in the sticks, and we want to be remote, and that's what we're looking for. But actually, that means that you are going to, if you only speak English, you might feel like you're in a bit of an insular bubble, and you might find it difficult to adapt. So yeah, definitely talk to people on the ground, and they'll give you an indication as to what to look for.
What to look for. So once you've spoken to your estate agents and you know approximately where you want to go, obviously there's funds involved for some of you, and probably raising mortgages or selling a property in the UK. So Chris, I'm coming over to you. How difficult is it to raise a mortgage on a UK asset as a global UK resident?
So great question. And in terms of if you were resident overseas, kind of in any jurisdiction really, I think you're going to struggle to get lending from a standard high street bank. They're very basic in the way they look at things. They want somebody to have been resident in the UK for say 2-3 years as a minimum, often have indefinite leave to remain, and be paid in sterling, which is just quite often not the case, especially looking at the London market. You've got a lot of clients, say from the US, are moving to the UK for the first time, they don't have address history here, don't have a credit footprint, don't have a credit file, and everything is kind of based outside of the UK, even if they're not looking to move to the UK. And just maybe buy a base here for son, daughter to go to school, or if it's just a place to visit family when in the UK. Often, yeah, like I said, the standard lenders will struggle with that. That's where at Enness we've got access to the entire lending market. So more so the private and investment banks and specialist lenders are able to take that kind of holistic view on somebody's wealth. They're often not concerned that a client's resident overseas, as they're able to take foreign income into account, or even if a client doesn't have a regular income, we can look at the wider wealth, investment portfolios, etc., property overseas if it's generating income, to be able to then demonstrate that it's affordable for them to support a mortgage payment on a UK asset, even if they've got a residence still overseas and they're buying a residence in the UK. If we can demonstrate that they can afford the living costs overseas and in the UK, then it's not necessarily a problem. They don't have to look at a kind of UK credit file, as long as the client can show them making their current commitments overseas. So that's really not a barrier to entry for us. It's just understanding the client's overall picture so that we can get a lending solution together. The same as if, Enness, we're able to help clients look at buying property in Europe, or we've just recently done one in Dubai, and we're looking in the US as well. Very similar sort of situation where we're just making sure that the affordability is there regardless of where their income is and what currency it's derived in.
So if, let's say, I reside in the UK, decide to go and live in Portugal, for example, would you then be able to help me raise some fund for a Portuguese property? And would I then need to remortgage? If I need a mortgage, could I remortgage my flat in the UK to buy a property in Portugal, and you would help with all that?
Absolutely. I've got a gentleman doing that very thing at the moment. I've actually got a handful of cases where clients are not necessarily looking to up and leave the UK and sell all of their assets, because it still does make sense to own a property here, and it's helpful if they're still residing in the UK or spending a bit of time in the UK. But we can use and leverage funds against their existing property. Again, my client at the moment is looking to do it in Spain, buy a property outright in Spain. So we've raised a healthy sum to be able to then take those funds over to Spain and buy his holiday home outright. So it just means now he can either take up residency in Spain or stay in the UK, but he's got assets in multiple jurisdictions. And again, Lumon were helping with the trade on that as well, to make sure that they were able to get the funds across borders in the most competitive way. So yeah, we're seeing quite an increase of clients doing that.
Fantastic. And what's the process, and how long would that take to raise the funds?
So just to give you a bit of a snapshot in terms of how long the initial stage takes and then the overall process, I'd have an initial call with a client, which from from that point, I can then go away, research the market, and make sure, as I said, we've got access to the entire lending market, so we can make sure that we're getting the most competitive deal. Now, that can take sort of 2 to 3 days, depending on the complexity. Once we then have a formal term sheet from the most competitive lender, I can submit an application. I would say on average, it probably takes about 3 to 4 weeks to get a mortgage offer, which is formal credit approval, property valuation has been completed, and then that's the lender saying they're happy for the client to draw down on the mortgage once the legal work is finalised. So it can happen quicker than that, but it's obviously subject to providing documents, surveyors availability, and the credit approval. But I guess an overall process, including the legals, can take about 6 to 8 weeks to complete. Is probably on average now, maybe a little bit longer, depending if the client's in a chain. But that's your kind of overall timeframes.
That's really good. And can you share some example of the loan to value and volumes clients are raising?
Loan to value, we can go pretty aggressive, like a lot of international clients when buying property in the UK. Again, I'll use the kind of US side of things. They often want to keep as much of their wealth overseas as possible, which means we're then needing to get quite high loan to values in the UK. I recently had one client bought for 3 million in the UK. We were able to get 85% loan to value, which meant they had to put a lower deposit down. If you're looking for again a high street bank to lend, often they can cap out at about 65 to 75%. So that was just such an added benefit, and also we could keep that on, most of that on interest only. We do what we call part and part repayment, so keeping the majority of the mortgage interest only with a small portion on capital and interest payment, which means it just keeps the monthly payment lower, which can always often be helpful for clients, again, if they're not looking to bring too many funds to the UK. It helps having a lower monthly payment that they're committed to. The highest loan to value I was recently able to achieve against a 4.5 million pound property. We got 90% loan to value confirmed. Again, that was a client looking to increase the lending against his current property to again buy a property overseas, which is we're seeing quite a big increase on. For that, the affordability has to be very robust. Naturally, there's a smaller amount of equity in the property, and the lender will often require bullet payments to bring down the mortgage balance within the 5-year period, just so that they're reducing their risk there. But it's good for entrepreneurial clients that have quite a significant trajectory of income, or if they've got the wealth in the background to be able to pay down the mortgage if need be.
Thank you. And I think that there's a question that could be between you and John, actually, which is it best to sell a UK home property before starting the process to moving overseas? Do you guys, or John, do you want to take that question? Because I think that kind of flows with everything else.
From my side, just quickly on that, I mean, and I think this, so depending on the client's wealth, we can look at a standard. So often clients will come to me saying, we found our dream home, we weren't expecting to do it, we thought we had a couple of years, we were going to sell our current place and then buy a new place, but we found it and we need to complete in the next 3 weeks. So I say, if you've got the equity in your place, we can do a bridging loan against the current asset, raise enough funds to then use as a deposit on the new place, and then we can get lending also against the new property. But we can bridge that gap, often meaning they don't even need to get any of their own cash in, and that will allow them to complete on the new place, and then they can sell their current place. Once the property's sold, it means also they don't have to do like a fire sale and take a massive reduction on the value of their current place. So from a lending perspective, I don't think it really matters. Like we can work around clients, but interesting to hear what John has to say in terms of the kind of actual selling and buying side.
Yeah, look, it's so specific to people's individual circumstances. It's difficult to give a sweeping statement that's relevant to everybody. If you're reliant upon equity release and mortgage portability, it might be a necessary evil. there might be some people where actually selling your main residence might not be a good idea if you're not 100% sure that you're going to settle where you're moving to. And it might be that you test the water with your toe and spend 12 months living in this location, and then and if you've got the capacity to do it, maybe you rent out your primary residence so that you've got that opportunity to revert back to where you are. And that might suit some people that are a bit tentative about the move. But if you're reliant upon equity release, and you're buying into a market, as I alluded to, in somewhere like France, where once you're in, you commit and you're committed to that transaction, you don't want to be left wanting, not able to liquidate the capital out of your property in the UK. So there are so many moving parts to that question, and each individual set of circumstances are going to produce an individual answer. But it can be stressful selling, and it can be stressful buying. Doing both at the same time, you might be compounding the problem. So, but if you've got the capacity to be able to buy without doing that, then obviously you're in a very fortunate position. Then maybe once you've found, you can then go back and then liquidate the asset.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to go over to Matt from Lumon now, because Chris kindly mentioned Lumon and how you guys work together when it comes to currency movement. So Matt, what's the difference between using the bank of a service like yours?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the main reasons we exist in the first place is because typically banks don't offer very competitive rates of exchange. You know, we exchange close to £10 billion worth of currency every year. It's about 30–40 million pounds a day. So it allows us to buy a much more competitive level using our providers. And I mean, we mystery shop banks and other providers to get kind of an average of what the rates will be or the fees will be associated with exchanging funds. And typically on about £50,000, if you're saving £500 to £1,000 on that amount, you can imagine how that adds up with much larger amounts of funds. So yeah, I mean, that's one of the main benefits, but it becomes more apparent when you start looking at the difference in currency movements. I mean, sterling dollar, for example, was a great example. And it doesn't happen very often that you see such a change in a currency rate, but I mean, it started the year at about 121 and it peaked this year at about 137. So that's a change of over 10% in the currency rates alone. Thinking about exchanging £500,000, that's an extra $80,000 that you're looking at for just on the currency rate. So it does really matter, especially if you're looking at buying a property and deciding whether it's going to be a 4-bedroom or a 5-bedroom. Then you can have that conversation with your currency broker. But like I said, we're not here to offer advice or tell you what's going to happen, because quite frankly, no one knows what will happen. But it's just so that you have more expertise or guidance around what's happening, and so that you can make more of an informed decision on your currency, as opposed to going in blind and exchanging when you need them.
And if I don't have a bank account in the country where I'm moving to, can I still talk to you?
Yeah, of course. I mean, essentially what you have here is a free multi-currency account, so you can send and hold funds here anytime you like, and we'll initiate those payments when you're ready to do so. We're what's called an e-money institution. So that means that you're able to hold funds here for as long as you need, and they're fully protected for the entire duration. So that's unique to only a select few brokerages, so ones that have been around for a long time, who exchange a certain amount of currency. But we have to follow a method called safeguarding, where essentially your funds are held in a segregated account under your name, so it's not pooled with the rest of the company's funds. So if anything happens to our firm, even after 25 years, your funds would still be fully protected from that. So yeah, if you are concerned about the rates, you can preload your account with any currency you're looking to exchange. We can discuss the timing of it ahead of the a future payment. And there's no fees for doing that. There's no fees for just having a conversation with us if you just want to understand what might happen and how we can help.
And how have the recent events impacted the market, and how can you help? I guess you answered a bit of that question already, but
yeah. Well, I mean, it's been a bit of a crazy year so far with the tariffs and the implications of that on global trades and all kinds of interest rate cuts happening, which I'm sure affects the rest of you. But Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest talking points as well will be the budget coming in November. So you'll start to see a lot of speculation happening around that about what might be announced at that meeting. But there's a saying in the currency world that the market moves on expectation just as much as facts. So a currency can gain or lose value just depending on what the market thinks will happen. So we have to try and will predict and navigate that. And we do that in a lot of different ways. We have forecast data that we get from over 50 financial institutions and research teams to kind of give us an idea of what might happen over the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months ahead. And it's not always best to look at forecast data because it's not always accurate, but it gives you a good idea of what might happen. And then you've got different contract types, so like a limit order, for example, to say, well, I need to exchange when the rate's at 130 on sterling dollar, so we'll put that order into the market and we'll only book that exchange once that becomes available, just to kind of just watch the market whilst it's moving around quite a bit. And if you don't have access to your funds, you can look into what's called a forward contract, which essentially is a buy now and pay later structure for currency. So if there's an advantageous rate available, or you are concerned about the rate moving against you, but you don't have the funds available, we can purchase that currency, hold the rate, and then you can settle at a later date. So like I say, having a conversation around what might happen in the future, and if you are concerned about it, there are things you can do from a currency perspective. And like I say, the difference from a good rate and a bad rate can be drastic.
It can be a bedroom or a swimming pool, couldn't it?
Exactly.
We had a question coming in asking, it's a bit of a tricky, maybe a tricky one, is this a good time to change pound sterling to other currencies?
I can't tell you whether it's a good time because that would be bordering on advice, but in terms of the different currencies, as I said, sterling dollar, sterling AED, if they're currency pairings that interest you, over 10% up in some of the best levels we've seen in about 4 years now. So it's doing a lot better than it has been, with so much uncertainty about what's happening with the dollar and interest rate cuts over there, which you may see towards the end of this year. But as a result of that, so this is where it can get a bit interesting, is that you see the dollar weakens so much, the most traded currency pairing is dollar euro. So in effect, the euros then bounced back and had a bit of a good year, which has then caused sterling euros to drop down because the euro is so strong. So yeah, sterling euro is down quite a bit on the year so far, down about 6 or 7 cents to date. So yeah, these kind of things is you have to keep an eye on. You can't just look at what's going on in the UK to get a picture of all of the global currency, and that's what we have to try and navigate.
Thank you very much. It's riveting. What you're doing, so interesting. So yeah, anyone thinking about moving abroad and wants to have a bit more knowledge and security in their finances, definitely talk to Lumon. Now I'm going to go over to Jake. We had so many questions around tax implications and pensions and all of that. So Jake, first question for you is, am I still liable to inheritance tax when I leave the UK based on the new rules?
Yeah, so this depends on many different factors, but if I just explain firstly when you would be liable. So in the UK, you have something called a nil rate band. So every individual is entitled to £325,000 without any inheritance tax whatsoever. There's an additional rate which is called the residential nil rate band. This is £175,000. So if you're a married couple, there's £1 million there without any inheritance tax at all. Once you get to 2 million, for every you lose £1 for every £2 above on your residential nil rate band. But if you decide to leave the UK, you actually lose the residential nil rate band completely because it's no longer your main residence. You're now living outside of the UK. So best case scenario really would be the 325 per individual. Anything above that in the UK is taxed at 40%. So the UK is very, very punitive when it comes to inheritance tax, and it has somewhat got better, people that are leaving. And I'm quite glad that they've made the changes. I'm not sure they really thought this through, but from a planning perspective, as a financial planner, there's loads of things that can now be done. So the new rules are much, much clearer than what they were in the past. If you spend more than 10 consecutive years outside of the UK, you're now classed as what they call non-dom. So have you ever heard of the term domicile? This refers to whether the UK would tax you for inheritance tax when you pass away. There are benefits being alive now with non-dom. So if you've been outside the UK for more than 10 years, you would be classed as a non-dom, and that means the UK would only tax you based on your UK-based assets. So that means you want to get everything outside of the UK where possible. Okay. The one change they have made though, which is because most people's assets in the UK, the biggest assets they have are either their property or their UK pensions. So UK pensions as of 2027 are now going to fall under your estate for inheritance tax. And they've closed the door pretty much to being able to transfer that into what's called a cure-ops. Because if you transfer it into a cure-ops and the cure-ops isn't based in the country where you're living, there's now a 25% overseas transfer charge for going into that. So in some circumstances, it is the best thing to do. You have to look at the HMRC list to see if there is a cure-ops available. But most people in the past would have gone into a cure-ops in a jurisdiction in Malta. So if you're moving to Malta, fine. If you're not, the option probably isn't there. So that means if you've got, for example, bank accounts, having a bank account in the UK, you want to get it out of there. Any investment accounts, move outside of the UK as well. So it just means you're moving your assets offshore. And where I said is where you could benefit by being alive, 15% of our clients since we set up the business 8 years ago have ended up moving back to the UK. And this could have been because of family reasons, or one of the partners passed away and they wanted to spend time or live closer to people that they know. Someone gets ill and they don't like to deal with the public health system in a different language. So people move back. So let's say you've lived outside of the UK for more than 10 years. And it's also retrospective. So if you've already been outside of the UK for 10 years and this rule's now in place, you are already a non-dom. It's not like you've got to wait another 10 years. So let's say you've been outside the UK for 10 years and you now go back to the UK. There is, for 4 years, you avoid paying UK taxes. So you could realise all of the gains in your investment as long as you have your money offshore in a specific investment vehicle, and the investments within that investment vehicle are offshore as well. And what I mean by offshore is you can buy, for example, a fund or an ETF, and it has what's called an ISIN number. So if the ISIN number doesn't begin with GB, which stands for Great Britain, that would be offshore, but it's only in specific investment vehicles. So we structure people with assets, and we make sure we do things tax neutral. And tax neutral just means that we're keeping your assets in a jurisdiction where you haven't got capital gains tax, you haven't got inheritance tax, you haven't got dividend tax, no tax whatsoever, which means you're just liable for taxes in the country where you're living. And that means that it is portable around the world. And if you do go back to the UK, it becomes a lot more simple, and then you can take advantage of this 4-year rule. So there are other things to be aware though for inheritance tax. You have to think of the local rules as well. So avoiding the UK inheritance tax doesn't mean you avoid the local inheritance tax. And if you're moving to somewhere like Europe, the UK works off of what's called common law, whereas Europe is civil law, and civil law has forced heirship. So in the UK, it's very simple. You say, right, I'm going to give this asset to this person, this asset to that person, and you can do whatever you want. But in Europe, for example, it's based on your family structure. There are ways around this based on the Brussels Convention, so you can still use an English will. And I say English because an English will, a Welsh will, or a Scottish will, they're all completely different, and they have different caveats. So actually the English one is actually the best. But if you're moving to Europe, then you need to make sure that your will covers all of your assets, because let me just take France as an example. The UK and France both have something called a spousal exemption, which means you can pass your assets onto your spouse with no inheritance tax whatsoever. But if you go off the French forced heirship rules, the rest of the tax is based on who you pass it on to. So the tax rate's different for a child than it is for a sibling, than it is for a parent, than it is for a friend. And this is all across Europe as well. In Spain, it's different per region. So, for example, Andalusia is completely different to Balearic Islands or somewhere else. So, you know, there's many different things to look at, but the best thing is to speak to a financial planner that understands those different caveats to really plan, because planning ahead is by far the most important thing to do. So there's a lot of information there, but it is really complex when you're dealing with two different countries.
It seems to be, and as well as you say, it's all well and good to maybe go, okay, I'm not going to pay the inheritance tax in the UK after 10 years. However, you need to be mindful of what are the laws in the country where you're moving to, and you might actually be paying more taxes in that country than you are in the UK. So I'm guessing talking to you is probably the best bet when it comes to looking at inheritance tax. I'm French, by the way, and I'm joking with my parents, saying to them that they can't remove me from the will.
There's even things with if you, because you can use an English will, but if you have, for example, you're married in from a French family, sometimes you can't use that English will. So there are certain circumstances where someone from the UK may not be able to do that, depending on if there are any if there's French family members within that. So yeah, there are some weird and wonderful things.
Yeah, exactly. So when it comes to pensions, what happens to my UK pension when I move abroad?
So when you move abroad, there's often a lot of restrictions that apply to UK pensions, and I'm mainly talking about if you have a SIP or a defined contribution pension, which could be called a money purchase scheme or a personal pension. There's loads of different names for the same sort of thing. But your paperwork, so in the UK, you've got two different options. You can take the pension via flexible drawdown, which is basically, I want to take the money however I want. So you can stop and start it, take it all in one go, take regular withdrawals, or you can hand your pension over to an insurance company and you buy what's called an annuity. Once you buy an annuity, there's no going back. So this is a fixed income for life, and the annuity company makes their money by effectively betting on what your average life expectancy is going to be. Once you leave the UK, though, annuities, we cannot offer an annuity to someone outside of the UK post-Brexit. So the annuity option's pretty much closed down. There are very rare circumstances if you have a UK pension scheme and they have some sort of in-house annuity that was set up and they've still got terms of business post-Brexit, but I'm talking maybe 1 in 30 where that option's available. So that means you're left with flexible drawdown, but you may not have this option when you leave, and it's probably about 2/3 of the time this option's closed down. So your paperwork could say, I've got flexible drawdown, but then when you come to taking money from the pension scheme, the provider says, no, you've got to transfer your pension. And we get inquiries all the time where people are retiring and now they've got to transfer their pension. And to transfer your pension, if you're an overseas resident, I factor it in on the cash flow for the company for 9 months. It certainly isn't a quick process. The other restriction could be on death benefits. So if you're a UK resident and the beneficiary is a UK resident, if you died, the pension member died pre-75, the beneficiary can inherit that tax-free as a lump sum. If you die post-75, it's taxed at their marginal rate. So post-75, the best thing is to leave it in the pension, because you can move it into a dependence pension, which means it stays within the pension wrapper and the beneficiary just draws it out just like the pension member would have done. But outside of the UK, it's almost always taxed. And we had an inquiry a couple of years ago. Husband passed away. They were living in Italy, and the widower, she said, "What can I do with this pension scheme?" Because they're saying I have to receive it as a lump sum, and it was a £400,000 pension pot, and she ended up having to pay almost £200,000 in tax because the pension scheme didn't have the option of moving the pension into a dependence pension. And this happens a lot. So you could even have, for example, a UK SIP, which is the most flexible pension scheme there is, and this option's closed down. And the reason they close this option down is because there's so many times where they could get sued if people live outside the UK, they provide the wrong tax advice. So what you want to do is the option that you have if you leave is to go into what's called an international SIP. So it's still a UK registered pension scheme, but it's available for non-UK residents. And that means it's completely flexible. So you can have it paid into any bank account. There's no restrictions on withdrawing the money. There's no restrictions on the death benefits. And the added benefit as well is you can invest into any major currency you want. Whereas within UK pensions, it has to stay into pounds. So if, for example, there is a good exchange rate, so as Matt was saying, pound dollar, probably a great time to maybe exchange that across into dollars. You can take advantage of that. So it gives you more flexibility, and you don't have to then worry that the provider is going to turn around and say, no, we've just closed the door, because we did have someone in South Africa, retired for 15 years, was taking flexible drawdown, and then the scheme said, no, we're not going to offer that anymore, and he had to transfer.
So again, a lot to think about in terms of pension, and if you're thinking about moving abroad, again, talk to Jake and he will be able to help you with the best options for you. Very briefly, because I'm aware of time, and we need to move on to Geoffrey as well, who has loads of questions as well. What are the tax implications of leaving the UK?
I'll make it short. So public pensions, they're generally taxed in the UK. As long as there's a double taxation agreement, you wouldn't pay tax twice. UK pensions, the ones I was just mentioning, the pension commencement lump sum, which is the 25% amount, which would be tax-free in the UK, it's paid gross of tax, but then it's generally taxed. Okay, France is a good country. You can take the whole pension out at 7.5% tax rate, and if you've got the S1, that's the only tax you pay. But pretty much most other countries outside of the UK, it would fall under income tax. And then the other 75% is the annoying part. It is taxed at source in the UK, which you have to claim back, or you can file something called an NT tax code, which is what we help clients with. You can't always get it, so it depends on what other assets you've got, but then you wouldn't be taxed twice, so you just end up paying the tax in the country where you're living. ISAs, they're not tax-free when you leave the UK. Neither are premium bonds, they're taxed as well. So you really want to make sure you understand or try to sell these whilst you're a UK resident, and bear in mind that the UK works off of an April to April tax year, whereas the rest of the world generally works off of a calendar tax year. I had a client in Germany last year, and he thought by selling his assets the week before he moved to Germany, he was still a UK tax resident, and he had £155,000 worth of gains in his ISAs, which would have been tax-free in the UK, and he had to pay about £35,000 in taxes, just because he made the decision based in the wrong tax year. There are other products, the last one, offshore bonds, which are very problematic once you leave, and also not the best to sell whilst you're in the UK. So that product would depend on where you're going.
Thank you very much. So again, I think planning, very important when it comes to everything, your pension, currency, everything, just plan in advance. Geoffrey, over to you. Again, a lot of questions for you. So the first one is, what happens if I want to split my time, let's say half the year in the UK and half the year abroad?
So the issue is that the UK has a statutory residency test, and that is essentially a set of rules that determine your tax residency status. So it's not simply a matter of counting the 183 days. So what it looks at a number of ties that you have. So accommodation, family, work. So all of those things will have to be taken into consideration. So if you spend 183 days, then HMRC will most likely consider you a tax resident. Even if you spend below 183 days and you have a number of ties, you can still be considered a tax resident. So one of the things that you also have to look is at the resident, what is the rules to be considered a tax resident in the other country that you're staying in. So this is where we work with individuals and to ascertain all of the assets they hold, and what their lifestyle plan is going to be, and then working alongside with tax advisors who would give expert tax advice, we would be able to determine whether they are going to be considered a tax resident in the UK or a tax resident in their new locality that they stay in.
So does it mean that you could be considered a tax resident in both countries?
Exactly, and that's one of the typical mistakes that people actually find themselves in. And so if they, without strategic planning, where we can look at the times when they're looking to leave, when they would be considered a tax resident, those are the kind of things that you want to avoid.
Okay, fantastic. And so a few questions actually, which I think Jake mentioned domicile and residency. What are the tax differences between the two?
So the tax residence differences between two is that when you are domiciled, domiciled looks more at the assets that you, what HMRC consider, are you domiciled in the UK? So it's looking at your wider estate. So that's the number of ties that you have within living in, say, in the UK. So if you own a home, if you have children that go to school over here, then even if you do not necessarily are resident in the UK, if HMRC consider you domiciled there, then you would be subject to tax. Whereas with residency, that's based on the amount of days that you actually spend within the UK. And that's the difference between tax domiciled and residency.
Okay. And are there any programs that people can qualify for from a tax perspective?
Are there any programs that they can qualify for?
I think you had a question. How much money do I realistically need to qualify for these programs?
Okay, so that really depends upon, so globally there are so many countries that have so many different programs. They're split between residency and citizenship. So for example, if you're looking at, say, for the citizenship programs that are available in the Caribbean, they can start off from around 230,000 plus as a donation and increase more with your, say, looking to invest in real estate. With Europe, again, it really depends upon, well, different countries have different pricing. So the Italian investor visa looks at you investing €500,000 into an Italian equity in order to be used as a qualifying asset. A similar thing operates in Portugal, where you invest, again, €500,000 into an investment trust. But there are other options where you can put things about €2 million into, with some of the other European programs, into government treasuries. So it really depends upon what program, what jurisdiction they're looking to move to, and then what will be the qualifying asset that will enable them to be able to get the residency.
And am I right, there was actually, weirdly enough, a lot of questions around Portugal, which is, we have a webinar for it tomorrow. So as I say, if anyone can join in, please join this one. But I think you answered this one, which is, how much do you need to become a Portuguese citizen? And am I right in saying that the golden visa rules have changed in terms of property, and now the investment need to be other than in property to be able to access the citizenship?
Exactly, yes. So previously, real estate used to be used as an option in order for you to be a qualifying asset. Now it's $500,000 into an investment trust. Now there are a number of different government-approved investment trusts that you can invest in, and that can be used as the qualifying asset. And that's one of the most popular routes for people to get residency in Europe, especially more so because with the Portuguese residency program, it is one of the few programs that limit the amount of time that you have to spend within Portugal. So most of the European programs require you to spend a minimum of 183 days a year to be eligible to go through the process of naturalization once you reach the catchment number of years that you have to spend consecutively in that country. With Portugal, you are only required to be there for 1 week every year for 5 years, and then in your 6th year, you can start the process of naturalization. So that's one of the reasons why it's incredibly popular, because it gives people the freedom and option to be able to stay in their host country and still visit Portugal and still use that as a route to be able to get European citizenship in the long term.
And so there is a question here, which I must admit, so I've got a list of questions here, and usually I know who can answer this one. But Geoffrey, it might be you. Do I have to be a resident in one country for 6 months, or can I move around the world to be considered non-resident to HMRC?
So it depends. So if you are, first and foremost, this is why I say it's important to really work with specialists and for us to sit down and really ascertain what is your situation. So working with tax advisors, what we would look at is first making sure that they could break their residency with HMRC. So you would contact them and then break your residency with all of the required information that HMRC needs. But then once you travel to whichever resident country that you're looking at, then they will have their own requirements in order for you to be considered a resident there. So for example, I said that the Portuguese residency program only requires you to be eligible to be a resident by making the investment, but also spending a week every year in order to be eligible for the process of naturalization. Now, if you want to be considered tax domiciled in Portugal, then you would have to be there for 183 days in the year. So it really depends upon which is the country that you're looking to go to in order to claim tax residency status there, or if you want to just essentially be a traveling nomad and not really have tax residency status in any country.
Yeah, you can't cheat the system and not pay taxes in.
You have to pay.
That would be a good one.
And especially one of the things that people also miss is that just not being a tax resident doesn't mean that you don't have to pay taxes on your assets that you own in different countries. So if you have any assets that you are held in the UK, say for example you are renting some property, you will still have to pay tax on that rental income that you earn in the UK. If, say for example, you own equities globally and you are paid dividends, you would have to pay dividends pay tax on those dividends, and that's where it really matters about which country you're taking your domicile or your status, because if that country does not have a tax, has a tax treaty, then you would be subject to withholding tax. And so that's one of the things that you have to look. So with us, we sit down with the clients and really understand what their situation and make sure that we can have a kind of holistic look at making sure that they get all of the services that they need.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm aware of time. There's so many questions I haven't been through, but the webinar will come to an end. So one last question. I actually had two in mind, so I don't know how quickly you guys can answer. But I'll choose this one very quickly. We'll start with Chris. If you were moving out of the UK, which country would you go to and why? Very quickly.
It's probably got to be the Middle East at the moment. Tax break, sun,
tax break.
Get on a yacht and just have a good time.
Fantastic, thank you, John.
I'm going to say anywhere but the Middle East, but then that's my Nordic complexion, and I don't do well in the sun, so so I'll do the polar opposite. I could just about cope with Spain or Portugal. And I'm a huge fan of Portugal. I love the place. I'm a golfer as well, so I'd feel at home.
So Portugal and golf, fantastic. Geoffrey?
For me, it'd probably have to be one of the Caribbean islands, probably St. Lucia. You have beautiful weather, you have beautiful scenery, and you have all of the tax benefits that you get in the UAE anyway. So it works for me.
There we go, perfect. Matt?
Yeah, we do lots of work in France, Portugal and Spain, so those places have become pretty appealing to me, but the currency rate isn't very appealing, so I'm probably going to stick with Chris and go to the UAE.
Okay, fantastic. Two for the UAE. Jake?
Well, I live in Spain, so I've already made the choice. So I'm going to say Spain.
You're going to say Spain, fantastic. Talking about digital nomad.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And one last one, because I've got a minute left. How far in advance do you think someone should prepare before leaving the UK? Chris?
Going back to getting mortgage advice, I would say that there's there's no time that's too soon to start talking about it. I think the earlier you start prepping from anything, transferring funds abroad, mortgage planning, property, I think just get way ahead of the curve, because there is just so many different options to look at now, different areas of your move, that I think it's always good to be prepared. And I just don't do impulse stuff, or be prepared.
Thank you. Geoffrey?
Again, I agree with Chris. Now is the best time to start, especially if you're trying to make sure that you want to fit into the tax year. I would say at a minimum, you have to have about a year, because if you're looking to go and try and get these residency programs, it's not something that happens overnight. You still have to go through the process, provide all documentation. So I think it's best to have a consultation immediately, and then if you're looking to actually make that move, at a minimum, have at least a year.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Jake? Oh, we can't hear you, Jake. We lost you.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. I would also say a year, because then you can avoid, for example, missing out in the wrong tax year. We can plan what to do with your assets before, and it normally takes about 3 months to go for everything with everything that we have to cover anyway. So, and then if you're transferring a pension, on average, it takes 9 months. So, yeah, I'd say definitely a year.
Yeah, thank you. Matt?
Yeah, I mean, from a currency perspective, I mean, when you're looking to actually move something abroad, or you're putting your house on the market, that's probably what you're looking at there. But just taking some of the information from this webinar, things that Geoffrey said in terms of the taxes in different countries, and Jake scared me a little bit with some of the things he said about pensions. So yeah, I think it's probably best just to speak to some of these guys well in advance if you are considering it. And yeah, when it comes to moving the large amounts of currency, speak to Lumon.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, the one thing that we haven't touched upon is the length of time it might take you to liquidate your asset and sell your main residence. And we're in a very volatile housing market here in the UK. There's a cloud in the distance with possible tax reform, with the coming budget. There might be a lot of sellers out there at the minute that have got an expectation for what their house is worth, and the reality could be very different. So, 12 months is sensible to start talking numbers, talking to agents, and then making a provision for when you're going to launch to market, when you're going to start viewings, hopefully when you agree a sale, and then enter into the joys of conveyancing. So all of these things are factors that you need to think through.
Fantastic. Thank you very much all. It was a really, really good webinar. Thank you all for your insights. As I said, we will pass on all the questions that we haven't been able to answer, so that you can answer them in the background. And I hope to see you all soon. Thank you very much, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.